Thank you. Thank you. I was just checking my phone actually because I'm the one that actually always forgets to put my phone on silent, and as all of you will who are going to the bar will discover, there will, I promise, be a time when you get to court and your phone goes off and you've got to come up with something vaguely amusing like, sorry, it's my wife or whatever, to deal with that. But there are some extraordinarily grumpy judges who will not smile with you, I can promise. I want to talk to you today, as per the title of this talk, of course, about advocacy at the Inns of Court College of Advocacy, ICA as most people refer to it. Advocacy is very much what we do. And as a lot of you will have experienced who've done mooting, and a number of you perhaps who haven't started on your, I always say I'm not going to talk about the journey, but there I've already done it, the advocacy journey, that actually it's incredibly important. It's very important for the bar to see that people are actually engaged with public speaking, that actually they're motivated by the idea of public speaking, because after all it is fundamentally at least a significant part of what the bar is known for. So what I want to do today is to assist you with, I hope, some hints and tips about what actually makes advocacy work. Often when I do talks on advocacy, I ask at the end, does anyone have any questions? And sometimes there are some questions, sometimes there's a lot, but quite a lot of the time there's actually not that many. And then when I'm putting my various bits and pieces together at the end, I look up and there's a whole queue of people standing there. And very often what those people want to ask me about is, do you know, I'm really interested in being an advocate, but I'm really fearful of being an advocate. I'm actually quite scared about the whole concept of standing on my own 2 feet. And I want to deal with that from the outset, that there will be times when you stand up and you do some mooting, or those of you that move on to bar school, you stand up for the first time and doing witness handling, for example, examination in chief or cross-examination, or submissions advocacy. There will be times, I promise, when you are in court, where your heart will be going da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. You'll feel it. No one else will hear it, but you'll feel it, and it'll be rushing through your system. And it's about actually channeling that energy into a level of excitement. If you say to yourself that actually you're excited about what you're doing, it has a wonderful way of channeling that nervous energy, if you like. And it's what you'll be doing at the bar. And of course, like anything, the more familiar you become with something, the easier it becomes. But the thing about advocacy is this, that it is something you will learn throughout all of your career. I like to think of advocates as thieves in some way, and I mean that in the nicest possible sense. Because actually, when you're in court, particularly as a junior barrister, when you're just developing your own style, you listen to a phrase here and there and you think, oh, I like that one, I'm going to take that one for myself. And I like that one, I'm going to take that one for myself. And actually, you pull all these things together and you add a little bit of originality, of course, but it's the mix that really creates the unique barrister that you are. So don't be afraid of doing that. One of the beauties, in fact, when you're at bar school, is listening to the other students go about their business in advocacy, the bits that you don't like and the bits that you do like. And it's exactly the same in a courtroom. So feel free to take or reject as you move along this particular pathway. I want to start off talking about advocacy with something that I hope you don't all yawn at, okay? Because the headline of it is preparation. Any advocate will say to you, okay, none of you are yawning, you're smiling, that's far better. Any advocate will say to you that actually a significant proportion, probably the most significant proportion of success in advocacy actually takes place before you even get into the courtroom. It's the quality of how you go about your business in getting to know your case, getting to know the facts, getting to know the papers, getting to know the law. You've got to work out a system for yourself that works. If you're doing a moot, for example, it will be usually in the Moot Court of Appeal or the Moot Supreme Court. If you're for the appellant, of course, you'll be seeking to undermine the judgment below. If you're for the respondent, you'll be seeking to support the judgment below. The first thing is to be really clear with yourself, therefore, what am I seeking to achieve? And it's the same always across the board as a barrister. It's about what solution are you seeking in this particular case. Then, of course, in any moot, let's just think about mooting, which is fundamentally appellate advocacy. It's what you would do in an appeal court. You will be looking very carefully at the judgment below. What is that judgment all about? Moots will always be based upon a particular judgment, almost always, as most cases will be. Remember that particularly in a moot, there will not be a right answer because it was designed like that. Otherwise, it would be too easy. Very often what you actually happens in moots is you actually have a case that is actually going through on its way to the Supreme Court, and no one knows what the answer is, according to their lordships and ladyships yet. So that's very often what happens. But you need to get to grips with that judgment. And you need to get to grips, of course, with the facts of your case. And it may well be of assistance to you. It's certainly something that I used to do, but everyone has a slightly different system. When you're working through the facts of your case, it can be sometimes extraordinarily helpful to actually just write a chronology out, because chronology is really good at embedding that information in your mind. I was someone, when I was preparing a case, that used to do a lot of scribbling. I don't mean, dawdling or doodling. I mean actually write my case out. Because for me, that was a good method of actually embedding it in my brain. And then before I go into court, I'd probably do a few highlights. What I wouldn't do, and I'll get to this, is stand there with my book reading it out. Because using a script really doesn't work. And what I'm going to be talking about when we get to presentation is sharing with you some of the very common mistakes, certainly at the ICCA, that we see with students who are new to advocacy. But they are some mistakes that are true of the practicing bar as well, because sometimes mistakes can come back into advocacy at a later stage. So preparation is absolutely key. Let's move on to the quality of your argument. When you actually put your case together, and I'm going to deal in a bit with skeleton arguments, you should be able to actually set out in reasonable simple terms what your case is. Lady Justice Andrews has a wonderful way of talking about this, a wonderful comment she made. She said, the question is this: how would you explain to a friend who gets easily bored why you should win? And I love that, i.e. short, to the point, simple. Why are you going to win? If you struggle actually articulating that, then there's a problem. So let's just look at what persuasive advocacy is. And this is whether it's written or it's oral. A submission is made up of two distinct parts. It's made up first of all of a proposition, and then it's made up of support for that proposition. If you have the proposition without the support, it falls flat. A proposition without support is, for example, I would be a good barrister. Would you be a good barrister? Yes, I'd be a good barrister. What I haven't done is said why. Okay? And if you make a proposition without support, you will be asked why. So the concept here is good advocacy actually avoids ever being asked why. You are consistently making your proposition. Let's look at an example. Let's say you're making a submission about the offence of murder. You could say in my submission, whilst an intention to cause grievous bodily harm would be sufficient for the full offence of murder, it wouldn't be sufficient for the offence of attempted murder. What's your support for that? In support of that, I refer your ladyship to the case of Wybrow, and then you go through where that case can be found. You could say, I'll take you now to paragraph 14, page 5,473,000 of my documents. There you have given a proposition, what you say the law is, and you have given support for it. Let's just turn that round for a bit, because a lot of you here, not all of you, will be doing law degrees, and you'll be used to not dealing with law in the same practical way that barristers do. You might say, Your Ladyship, may I refer you to page 1500 in the bundle, paragraph 3. You'll see there the judgment of Lord or Lady X at paragraph H. And let me perhaps, if you would wish me to read it out, perhaps I could read it out to you. So you're reading that out. Perhaps I could also refer you to page 1502, paragraph G, where the judgment of, and then you read that out. Yeah? Great. This is, you're doing your supporting part, except just think about that from the judge's perspective. The judge is thinking, why? Why are you taking me to this? Because in academic law, very often what you do is you go to a case, you rip it apart, you analyse it, you work out what it means, and then you come to a conclusion. Here, you're making the point, this is my proposition, and my support for that proposition is this. And if you go through it the wrong way and you go to the case first without making the point, without stating the proposition, the judge will be lost. And the judge will actually probably lose patience and say, what's the point of all of this? What is the point you're making? You don't want to find yourself in a moot or in court, I promise, being asked that, because suddenly it feels quite undermining, doesn't it? Well, what are you here for? What's the point of all of this? So if you go through that process of proposition support, that always works. If any judge would tell you this from in court or indeed in judging moots, I do a lot of judging moots. If you hear an advocate who goes through the process of, here's my first argument, my first submission, proposition, support. My second submission, proposition, support. My third submission, proposition, support. As long as those supporting statements or evidence or statute or case law, whatever it might be, as long as it is meaningful, i.e. you're supporting your proposition clearly, it's really difficult to ask that advocate a question. Because this is really powerful advocacy. It's like waves coming at you. I've got these 3 submissions, each of them proposition supported by evidence, by case law, by statute, whatever it might be. You're following that simple approach and it works so effectively. If you can take anything away from what I say today, please let it be that, because it makes a huge difference and it will turn your advocacy from something that could be pedestrian, from something that could require the judge to be extremely interventionist, into something that actually becomes very powerful and very persuasive. So please have a think about that. Now, when people are thinking about the law and using the law, as I say, you are looking at the judgment below. Be focused on what that judgment says. Sometimes, and you can do this on an appeal, you can take a completely new legal approach, but be careful about doing that. Very often you see in moots that people try and take a novel approach when actually they don't have to. They just simply need to analyse that judgment and distinguish that judgment and therefore make their submissions as to why that judgment shouldn't apply in the factual scenario of this particular situation, or particular case. There are some examples out there. The Unison case, if any of you are familiar with it, is a wonderful example. Diana Rose, as then QC, now KC, actually taking a point on behalf of Unison to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court found in her favour. What had happened in that particular case, I appreciate we haven't got a huge amount of time, but the government had decided that they were effectively going to make the users, service users as they call them, of the employment tribunal pay for the employment tribunal. They didn't see it as simply a place to get access to justice. Actually, they had to pay for it. It wasn't simply a public service. And they put the costs of using the employment tribunals up so much that actually it had a 70% drop-off in terms of its use almost overnight. Unison weren't very happy with this. One might understand why. And therefore a case took an interesting route through the courts, and it was fundamentally brought on the basis of EU law. It was brought on the basis of something of EU law that was the Equal Treatment Directive, as it was known. However, when it got stuck just before the Supreme Court and Diana Rose came in, a leading advocate without question, she looked at this and said, I don't think this is the right way of this case is actually breach of the common law, the fundamental common law right of access to justice. And that's the approach that she took. And of course, lawyers were coming up to her and saying, well, that's not what was argued in the court below. And she'd say, I know. That was the point. You can't change the facts, but you can change the law. And of course, that was Lord Reed giving judgment on behalf of the Supreme Court, one of the strongest judgments that was to come out of the Supreme Court. For any of you that haven't read it, I would suggest it's really, really good to read it because it gives you a really good sense. 2017 Supreme Court case. Certainly when Diana Rose spoke to our students, that was clearly one of the cases that she was most proud to have won. So that is a really good example of actually taking a new approach. I don't have enough time, even though I have some extremely funny examples to tell you about how it works the other way. But it's all about this. Ask yourself the question, can I actually support this proposition? Because you have to. Proposition support, proposition support. If you can properly support, I mean meaningfully, then you are always on the right path. Can you explain to a friend who gets easily bored why you should win? Yeah? Let's move on to skeleton arguments, because if you go into any moot, you are going to have to draft a skeleton argument. No one wants to look, by the way, at a skeleton argument that is so crammed with text that actually it's impossible to work out where it begins and where it ends, and actually where the space between the paragraphs are. Make sure a skeleton argument is a document, I mean visually, that you are proud of, because you should always think, why am I actually creating this? And you're creating it fundamentally because it sets out, of course, in skeletal terms, what your argument is. But you're creating it for the judge. Think of the judge as your friend. They may not look like your friend when you get into court, but think of them as your friend, okay? You know what judges are like. They can look grumpy. Not all of them. I appreciate it's being recorded. I'm going to be really, really careful about what I say. Some of them look grumpy, some of them don't look grumpy. But whether they look grumpy or not, just think of them as your friend. And the first place you can think of them as your friend is in the skeleton argument, because it enables the judge to read into your argument. It gives them an overview of what your argument is. And that's what it's all about. It doesn't go into an awful lot of detail, just in case, as an example, what I said about attempted murder earlier. You put your proposition, your support is just the case, you put it in brackets, of Wybrow. You're going to expand on that, of course, in your oral advocacy. That's what oral advocacy is all about. So you are just putting in simple terms here what your case is. Proposition support, proposition support. It allows the judge to understand where you're going, and your oral submissions, when you stand up in court in due course, should reflect the structure that you have used. Structure is really important in advocacy. Okay? Let's say that you fundamentally have 3 planks of argument that you want to advance in a moot. It's quite nice to be able to say, I wish to advance 3 arguments. In relation to which are these? You set them out briefly. In relation to the first argument, I have 2 submissions. In relation to the second argument, I have 3 submissions. In relation to the third, I have 2 submissions. What a beautiful structure, making it so easy for the judge. Argument number 1, argument number 2, argument number 3. You can visualise it now, can't you? 2 submissions, 3 submissions, 2 submissions. Makes it really, really simple. And I can tell you it works. It works to keep things simple. Like lots of beautiful things, they are made up of simple pieces. The overall effect may appear complex, but actually they're made up of simple parts. So keep your structure really simple. Think about it. Put it down on paper. As briefly as you can, and then follow that same structure when you get into court. But it's really important to do that. What you don't want to do is stand up and say, my lady, I do apologise, but actually I thought about this afterwards and decided that my third argument I was going to put first. You don't want to do that. And you know what really works? Practice. Surprise, surprise. Before you actually stand up in that courtroom, you've got your skeleton argument. Great, I've got my skeleton argument. I'm going to stand up. You might irritate mum, dad, husband, wife, brother, sister, cousin, best friend, whoever it might be that you live with, because they'll probably be fed up of hearing in my submission, I submit, it is submitted, all of those things. But actually, you've got to practice that advocacy, because in the process of practicing advocacy, very often it reveals to you a natural flaw in your argument. Perhaps you need to add some more support there, or a natural flaw in structure. Perhaps actually that third argument should go first. A lot of advocates, particularly junior advocates, think, do you know what? I'm going to build up to my strongest point. It's going to be great. Except it's not, because you should start with your strongest point, because judges have an irritating habit of asking you, what's your strongest point? So that would kill your ability to build up to it anyway in this dramatic way that you've considered in your own mind. Or alternatively, they might just say for themselves, well, I've looked through this skeleton argument. I'm not particularly interested in your first argument, but I want to start with your third one. So you've got to think about making sure that actually starting with my first point is the best thing to do. That is, I can promise you, what judges actually want to hear. And because particularly when we're looking at moots, but also in real courts now, you very often you're giving times and you've got to actually give a time estimate as to how long a case is going to take. You have to think really long and hard. Again, this is the proposition support concept. You know, just because I can launch an argument, does it mean I should? Can I properly support this particular matter, or actually is it worth just jettisoning that argument and really focusing on the ones that count? Okay, so again, that is about really thinking about that concept of whether you can support something meaningfully, but it is very obvious to you that when you practice it, whether this actually comes out in the way that your brain told you it would actually playing it out makes all the difference. I sometimes think it's a bit like a card game. Someone can tell you how it works, but you've got to play it to really understand how it works. So advocacy is no different in that particular sense. Keep it pleasant to look at, keep it well structured, keep it simple, keep it to the point. Great, you've done your preparation. You've got your skeleton argument, you've submitted it with pride because it looks so wonderful. And now you're going into court. We've talked about fear. That's okay because you're excited. You're going into court. So let's talk about going into court. And I want to share with you here what we see at the Inns of Court College of Advocacy from new students. Because these are common themes, okay? I'm not picking anyone out at all. These are common themes. The first one is pace. It's about moderating your pace. For a lot of us, if we speak far too quickly, some people can speak very well quickly. But for a lot of us, if we speak too quickly, we actually stumble over our words. And that's the reality of it. I think of it in many ways that if you're going too quickly, your mouth is ahead of your brain. It doesn't give you time really to think about the submissions you're going to make, to think about how you're going to articulate those submissions, to actually articulate them in a way that's eloquent, to the point, persuasive. And as I say, what happens, unfortunately, is that you trip and you actually fall over your own words. It's a bit like a Ferrari going up a mountain path, foot on the gas, too much, back end wheels spilling out, and you're thinking, I'm about to lose it. Foot off the gas, it gently comes back in, and you carry on. You're going up that pathway, okay? So it's really easy to lose control. And it's often inextricably linked, in fairness, with nerves. When a lot of us are nervous, we speak really, really quickly. Do you know what I used to do? I used to write on top, slow down, okay? I used to tell myself, slow down, because I know that I had a tendency to speed up, and it was a way of actually reminding myself visually, I know what you're doing, a piece of paper knows what I'm doing, and it's probably right, okay? So slow down. Again, practicing makes a big, big difference. Also, when you're speaking at a more moderate pace, not only does it allow you to control what you're going to say, but it's so much easier for the judge. It's so much easier for that poor judge, no, it says poor judge, but that judge who's your friend, you want to be your friend, to follow, okay? And this is all about, isn't it, taking the judge to a place where he or she is going to find in favour of your argument. That's what it's all about. And the easier, therefore, you can make it for the judge, the better. What else? Well, again, this is linked with pace, but a very, very common mistake is to produce a script. And people produce a script because they fundamentally don't trust themselves. That's really what it's about. It's a lack of self-belief, a lack of faith. Because I often say to students when they're scripted, and there they are, reading a script, you can imagine how boring it sounds. I say, hold on, put that down for a moment. You have sat down, you've looked at this case, you've prepared this case, you've been through the facts, you've been through the judgment, all of those things, haven't you? Yeah, it's taken me ages. So if I was to take you out for a coffee right now, and you left all those papers in your bag, and I was going to say to you, what's this case all about? You could tell me, couldn't you? Well, yeah. So what is it then when you walk through the door, which do sometimes look like that one, covered in wooden panels? Perhaps that's the problem. They walk through and suddenly that self-belief and that faith all falls apart. So the difficulty is to have what a lot of people think as their safety net, is I can promise you actually what happens is that safety net unravels into a piece of rope that wraps itself round your neck and strangles the life out of your argument. And again, it's about practice, 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 because when you do it, you will actually realise I am better than I gave myself credit for. I can do this without that script. So what would you use instead of a script? Well, you've got a skeleton argument. You are perfectly entitled, of course, to take in notes. And some barristers' notes will be quite brief and others will be fuller. But what I would suggest to you, all of you, is just think of using notes that fundamentally set out the key headings that you want to follow and that are followed with bullet points. And those bullet points set out fundamentally where you're intending to go. Yes, they'll be a little fuller, of course, in your skeleton argument because there'll be parts of your skeleton argument you want to amplify. But nonetheless, if you have a script, you'll find it very difficult, particularly in this situation. Imagine a judge says to you, as judges like to do, well, Mr. Kessling, that's all well and good. I think I've probably heard enough of your first argument. I want to hear your third one. Let's start with that. When I look down at a script, I can tell you what I'll see. I will see a sea of words and letters swimming around. That's what I'll see. I won't know where to go with it. I might say, I don't want to say, oh, but I'm on my first argument. That's going to irritate the judge. I could say, well, I will be coming to that in due course, but I'm perfectly happy to deal with it now if you'd prefer, when the judge might think, well, that's what I've just asked you to do. So they'll probably be a bit irritated. What you really want to do, of course, and you want to be able to go to that. Now, if you've got this nicely set out skeleton argument, plank 1 argument, plank 2 argument, plank 3, you've got your notes that are really easy for you to use. You can go to your third argument. You move to those seamlessly. What a beautifully prepared advocate you are. The judge will like you. And then you get to the end of that. I'll be talking a little bit more about answering questions in a moment, but you'll get to the end of that, and then you will be able to go back to where you left off. You could say, Your Ladyship, would you wish me to continue my first argument, or would you now wish me to move on to my second? Great, and you will be able to follow this simple structure that you've set out, and it will give you a wonderful level of credibility before the judge. Well prepared, able to actually move about, flexibility, and in every sense, it shows you as someone who has really thought your case through and is willing to work with the tribunal to assist them to develop your argument and assist them in coming to a conclusion, which, as I say, hopefully is going to be in your favour. Together with reading, the problem with reading isn't just in terms of what I've mentioned. I was going to say another thing about reading, false intonation. If we read, very often we use false intonation to make it sound like we're not reading. But it makes it worse. It just makes it worse. They call it, for radio presenters, your words lifting off the page. Very few people actually can do that well. But you don't need to even try. You can actually do your advocacy and should carry out your advocacy without using a script. So please don't fall into that trap. I've seen really good students actually fall on doing that single thing. And it's about self-belief. Eye contact, okay? Eye contact is important. Not obviously to stare at someone like I'm staring at you, which is sinister and weird, and you'll be thinking, hold on, why is he looking at me like that? But what I mean is to look up appropriately at certain times. Does it mean you can't look down at your notes? Of course it doesn't. That's perfectly natural. But what it means is that you are engaging with the judge. I always think, imagine yesterday, okay, you went out, or you'll do this tomorrow, you'll say, do you know what, this fantastic barrister gave this amazing talk on advocacy and it was so wonderful, and you'll be speaking to your friend. I'm joking about that. Let's say you went to see, I don't know, I think Rod Stewart was playing last night. No, I didn't go and see him. I'm sure none of you did. But let's say you went to see Rod Stewart, and Rod Stewart was someone you absolutely loved, okay? And you're telling your best mate this evening what a great time you had at that gig, okay? When you're doing it, you're going to be looking at them, aren't you? The bits you really like, you're going to be looking at them. Imagine the same thing. Yeah, saw Rod Stewart last night. It was really, really enjoyable. Really had a great time. It's just be ridiculous. The whole thing would fall flat. There's no actual sense in that at all. So to actually engage with a judge when you're making a point that matters, matters. Similarly, reading the judge matters. Sometimes, we've all been there, you're saying something and you realise actually the person you're speaking to is just bored rigid with it, irritated by it, whatever. We give away an awful lot of visual clues. So it allows you the wonderful ability to actually say, for example, Your Ladyship, I can see the way the wind is blowing in this particular case. Perhaps you'd allow me at this stage to move on to my third submission. The judge will like you for that. You're actually reading the room, you're reading your environment, you're alive to your environment, and sometimes it's the best clue you're going to get that actually it's time to move on. So think about that. Am I about to run out of time?
No, we've got like 5 to 10 more minutes.
Oh, that's good. I'm one of these people that can talk for a long, long time and very often go over time, so I'm delighted to hear. I mentioned about answering questions. You will, in a moot, you will be asked questions, I promise you, and I can tell you why. Number one, because the judge might actually want to know something, but also, perhaps more importantly, it's always part of the mark scheme. How you answer a question is part of the mark scheme. When you are in pupillage in your second six, or you're as a junior barrister, or indeed a senior barrister, judges will ask you questions because they genuinely want to know the answer. And actually, they're focused on the bits that the judge is concerned about. So you've got to use your answers to advance your case. So actually, you should welcome this whole concept. A number of you will be thinking now, I know this because I'm asked this question all the time, yeah, but what if I don't know the answer? What if I actually don't know the answer to that question? Well, first of all, let me say this. That is actually really rare. Why? Because you have prepared your case. Simple as that. Okay, it's about self-belief. So it's extraordinarily rare for that to happen. But if it does happen, worst case scenario, don't fudge it, you'll be found out, okay? It's far better, to be honest, and it gives you credibility, to be honest, to say, Your Ladyship, I'm afraid I'm unable to answer that. I do apologise, perhaps you'd allow me to move on to my next argument. Okay? Horrible, you don't want to do that. But do you know what? Point down for not being able to answer, but point up for your honesty. And that gives you a level of credibility before the tribunal that otherwise you would not have. If anyone suggests that actually you should just create an absolute lot of nonsense, you know, we've all been there, where actually you're out of control and you're talking but not really thinking, it's just not going to work. If, on the other hand, actually you feel you can formulate an argument even if it's difficult, by all means, go ahead, that's absolutely fine. But when you're absolutely lost, then be honest. It's a far better thing to do. The reality is that using your answers and actually enjoying and welcoming those questions to advance your case is something that makes a big difference. And as I say, I think it's a fear that an awful lot of people have, but actually it's something that the whole concept of not being able to answer something that doesn't actually happen very much in reality. So I'm going to answer any questions you have. I'm going to wrap up at that particular stage. But I just hope that what I've said, particularly as I say, if you take one thing away, please take away the concept of what makes a persuasive submission, proposition plus support, that preparation does actually really matter, that practicing reveals flaws, and actually it allows you to get a confidence in yourself to actually really bring this to life, because that's really what advocacy is all about. And finally, that all of you, when you do that, should have faith in yourselves. Remember, Dinah Rose KC at one stage would have stood up to be an advocate for the first time. Every single great advocate that you see out there stood up for the first time at one point. And I would recommend to all of you to do it. I call it an invisible line in advocacy. And the invisible line is this. You don't know where it is because it's invisible. But you'll cross it. And when you cross that invisible line, that is when you start to enjoy it. And that you start to enjoy it because that's when you realise that what you're saying is actually having an impact on the audience. It means that you're actually persuading the audience. And that, after all, is fundamentally what advocacy is all about. Thank you.